Father, Father, thank you for not just another day of your steadfast love, Lord, and specifically your Sabbath and the rest, Lord, that we can experience on the Sabbath, and also the fellowship and good company, Lord, and the fact that we can experience your holy presence in safety. And thank you for the blood of the Lamb of God that's removed our sins in order to approach your throne boldly, even so that we may experience just your loveliness and behold your beauty, Lord, and inquire in your temple, which is what this study is all about, Lord. So I pray that you would put your words on my lips, Lord, and give us all, Lord, your thoughts and your ideas, Lord, as we search the scripture, Lord, and just dwell in your presence right now, as we seek first the kingdom, and as we diligently search the scriptures, Lord. Pray that you would let our hearts burn within us and open our eyes to things that we have not yet seen, to behold wondrous things in your law. Pray this all in Yeshua's name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so just a quick review. I believe before Andy and Linda presented, where we left off was just a background to the intertestamental period. 400 years of not really silence, because it wasn't silent. But I don't know if you remember, this is actually was the intertestamental period where we see kingdom and messianic expectations and themes really coming to a boil, right? And they're just booming, right? And it really was because of the book of Daniel. The Jewish community was really into the book of Daniel, and that really accelerated these messianic expectations. So the book of Daniel became the model of messianic expectation and the kingdom, right? Because it was the book of Daniel that anticipated the day when the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will crush all the other kingdoms and bring them to an end. This kingdom in particular will be an everlasting kingdom, an enduring kingdom. Okay? That's what makes it messianic. That's what makes it. That's the kingdom, that we're talking, messianic kingdom we're talking about here. So when we opened to the book of Daniel 2, this is where we saw, these words in the days of those kings, right? We see specifically 4 kingdoms represented in gold. What was it? The iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold, right? Mm-hmm. And that in those days of the 4th kingdom, right, of iron, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. So we talked about how this was the Roman Empire, okay? Right. The Roman Empire was the time when Yeshua himself arrived, proclaiming the message, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is near. And it was in the days of the Roman and Greek, technically, because everybody was speaking Greek, okay? Yeah. The Romans took from the Greeks culture, the language, their gods,
yeah, their
right?
tutors.
Yes, so
their nasty habits.
In that way, it's even more specific because, where was it? Somewhere in this text it says that this kingdom, it's not just iron, but it's mixed with clay. It's this mixture of a kingdom. And that's exactly what the Roman, empire was a mixture. Anyway, so you see that it was in the days of the Roman Empire that Yeshua came to set up his kingdom and fulfill these words of Daniel 2. Okay, and Daniel 2 talks about this stone, right? That, how does he say? Oh, this rock that was cut out of a mountain, but not by human hands. So this is not a kingdom that's any of your ordinary human kingdom. It is one that is cut out by God himself, right? And that's what gives it the enduring quality, the everlasting nature of this kingdom. Okay? And that rock actually breaks the other kingdoms. The iron, the clay, the silver, the bronze, the gold to pieces. Right? But the rock itself, as you can see below here, the rock itself that struck the statue, which represents all those elements, became itself a huge mountain and filled the earth. And so we talked about how, it's the gospel spreading to all nations, all tongues, all tribes, all nations, filling the earth with what? Which we saw as a prophecy in Habakkuk, filling the earth with the knowledge of God, the one true God, the God of Israel himself. So it's still happening in our day. The gospel's still spreading. That kingdom is still coming. And it has come, and it is still coming, right?
Right.
So that's what we covered that there. And then we saw how also the book of Daniel, the Jewish community really looked to the book of Daniel for Messianic kingdom understanding, because it also it brings up this idea of the Son of Man, okay? This Son of Man is God's agent, and really the co-regent, who would be the heavenly Son of Man, to whom God would give dominion, over his kingdom, okay? So, like the everlasting nature of the kingdom, the Son of Man will also have everlasting dominion. So the Son of Man imagery really becomes at the center of messianic expectations during that intertestamental period, when these kingdom themes are boiling, right? So the image of the Son of Man is also, in a Jewish mindset, right? You have to think as a intertestamental Israelite. This image of the Son of Man is a development of the ancient promise, all the way back, connecting it all the way back to the head-crushing seed of the woman in the garden, right? The head-crushing seed of the woman back in Genesis 3, and it develops also it as Abraham's offspring. Remember, because Abraham was chosen by God, and through his offspring, all the nations of the world will be blessed. And then it develops even more specifically through David and the dynasty that was promised to David. So the son of David is himself the Son of Man. So these are the connections happening, right? In the Hebrew mindset that has studied Torah, right? That has these writings. Okay, and then we paused for Purim, so we did a couple pauses. We paused for Purim, we paused for, Andy's presentation and Linda, so we took a mighty pause there. Let's just go through these. Alright, so back to the kingdom study in Matthew. Yes. So we also covered this slide. I don't know how much you guys remember this, but so all these vivid messianic themes in Daniel are showing up very robustly, very colorful ways in the intertestamental period. Which is not 400 years of silence, because these are really raging. It's all the rage right now, okay? So, and especially even more so during the last 2 centuries prior to Jesus' ministry, prior to his showing up. Now, we went over a few disclaimers. So we talked about the literature during this time period. Falls under 2 categories: the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha. Okay, you guys are familiar with that, right? You've heard of it. So these are extra biblical, okay? Not because they're extra spiritual or more biblical than the other books. It's actually the opposite, right? It's because they are outside or beyond the biblical books, beyond the divinely inspired canon that we have you have as your Bible. Okay, these books didn't make it into the Bible, but nevertheless, they do provide very good context and history that will show us what was on the minds of Jewish people just before the events of the New Testament takes place, just before the Gospel of Matthew opens. Yeah.
Were these believed to have been written in the intertestamental period?
Yes, these were written.
Okay.
Most of these are written during the intertestamental period. Yeah. So, as I said, these intertestamental books are Jewish writings that are often classified as either apocrypha or pseudepigrapha. And apocrypha means literally hidden away, okay? And these are written works whose authorship is unknown and whose origins are doubtful, okay? Hence why they didn't make it into the Bible. So examples, you've maybe come across these before, maybe you've even read them before. Tobit, Judith, Wisdom, Sirach, 1 through 4, Baruch, first, 2nd, and 3rd, and 4th Maccabees, right? We look into the book of Maccabees, especially during Hanukkah, because it contains a lot of good Hanukkah history, actually. Anyway, and then pseudepigrapha comes from the Greek word pseudo, meaning false, and epigraphane, which is also Greek, meaning to inscribe or to write, and so therefore to write falsely, right? Or really under a false name, okay? A pseudonym. That's where we get the idea of pseudonym. So these are texts whose claimed author is not the true author, or it is a work where the real author attributed authorship to a figure in the past, like Abraham, Enoch, okay? So some of them, the books of Adam and Eve, of course, the book of Abraham, 1st and 2nd Enoch, the Assumption of Moses, Melchizedek. I need to read that one, actually. I've never read that. The book of Jubilees, the Testament of Solomon, and all that. So none of these guys, the actual authors, none of these actual guys actually authored that book because they were written during intertestamental period. Okay. Yeah. So. They were very okay. So these books were written after the completion of the latest book in the Hebrew Bible, which is actually not Malachi, but Daniel, probably the book of Daniel, and before the completion of the books of the New Testament. Okay. So they kind of carried into New Testament times. Okay. Like I said, they contain. I don't want to spend too much time on these, but they do contain a lot of good history and context that shows us more, brings about these messianic things. So I believe we looked at the example of the similitudes of Enoch. This is pseudepigrapha, so it's written under a false name. Enoch didn't actually write it, okay? But in this literature, we see this idea of God's elect one, right? Who is in fact identified as the Son of Man. Bye guys, thank you. I'll shut down.
Back.
Thank you. So he's identified as the elect one is identified as the Son of Man and as the Mashiach, the Messiah. Okay, and this figure will sit on the seat of glory and judge. Okay, he shall depose the kings from their thrones and kingdoms, which is a reflection back in Daniel 2. He shall crush the human kingdom, right, and destroy the wicked and dwell in a state of paradise, along with the righteous ones of Israel. Glory and honor shall be given back to Israel because they will repent and forsake the deeds of their hands. So basically what we see in this specific example of Enoch is we see the association of Daniel's Son of Man with the Messiah. So we match and pairing. Okay? In another book called the Midrash on Eschatology, eschatology just means latter days, end days, end times. And Midrash is just a little teaching, right? So we see also in this specific, in this Midrash, a clear association of the Messiah to the pattern of David. So, and actually we also see a blending of the kingly and priestly roles of the Messiah, which is unique because all throughout the Tanakh, right, the Old Testament, a priest couldn't be king and a king couldn't be a priest.
Right.
It's forbidden, right? Even though David kind of starts to function a little bit as a priest, but he foresees, he's ahead of his day. Anyway, but in intertestamental times, we actually see this growing expectation of these two roles becoming one, coming to one role in the Messiah, in this elect one, the Son of Man. So you're going to blend those roles. Okay. Next example, we have the Psalms of Solomon, Solomon 17 and 18, which was written in the late 1st century BCE. Here we hear the outcries and the longings of the Jewish people under the boot of Rome, right? The iron boot of Rome, especially at the time of Jesus' birth. Okay, so I'll just read it, it's fine. So, see, Lord, and raise up for them their king, the son of David, to rule over your servant Israel, to purge Jerusalem from Gentiles who trample her to destruction. He will gather a holy people whom he will lead in righteousness. He will purge Jerusalem and make it holy as it was even from the beginning. For nations to come from the ends of the earth to see his glory. There will be no unrighteousness among them in those days, for all shall be holy, and their king shall be the Lord Messiah. The Lord himself is his Messiah's king. So here, in other words, Messiah, the son of David, would be God's representative ruler on a restored earth, right? The renewal, in fact, of the original creation. The original creation mandate, back in Genesis 1. You can also compare this psalm with, I believe it shows it here, yeah. In parentheses, you can compare it with Luke 1, which is Zechariah's song, Zechariah's prayer, and you can see almost like verbatim expectations and verbiage in the New Testament, right? So, during this intertestamental period, we are already seeing these developing ripples, right, that we've been talking about, all coming together as an amalgamated profile of who the Messiah is going to be. Okay, he's going to be Daniel's son of man, right? Daniel's son of man is not only the kingly son of David, who also happens to function in the role of a priest, but he is also God's representative ruler of a restored earth, fulfilling the expectation all the way back to Genesis. And also Abraham's son, okay? So, flashes goes all the way back to Adam in the garden, the head-crushing seed of the woman. All these ripples are absorbed and developed in the image of Messiah. So, just before he actually arrives, right? The expectations are already being wrapped up there. So, I believe we also looked at, do you guys remember this map? I know it's very complicated. It's a lot to take in. But I want us to get even more specific about Jewish Messianic expectations during the Second Temple times. But first, I want us to orient ourselves a bit to the timeline of, well, what exactly is the Second Temple times, right? So, highlighted here in pink, you can see that the Second Temple times actually lasted 600 years from the destruction, or actually the rebuilding of the Second Temple after its destruction by the Babylonians. In 515, okay, Second Temple is built. This is during Ezra and Nehemiah's day, okay, and then it goes all the way to the destruction of the Second Temple again in 70 AC. Oh, yeah, right here, 70 CE. Okay, this is a period of 600 years. That's Second Temple times. You will notice that Yeshua is born around -4 BC. He's born here, and
Where can we get a copy of that?
I forgot where I got this from, to be
Oh,
honest, but I can send it to you.
would you?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'll send it to you.
thank you.
And it's a lot to take in, so you could just peruse it as it is.
Those intertestamental writings, do you know if they were widespread or people knew about them? To me, it's curious that they're called false writings, and yet they have.
Well, false just meant under a pseudonym. We still do that today. A lot of authors write under pseudonyms. know, and people have stage names and all sorts of stuff
Yeah,
like that.
so it doesn't mean.
It doesn't mean it's inaccurate information. You know, it can be inaccurate, there can be errors, or there could be depictions of certain people that contradict depictions of the same people in like the New Testament or something, you know? But the pseudepigrapha doesn't itself mean, oh, it's a bad work because it's inaccurate.
Yeah, wasn't the Assumption of
It's not.
Moses referenced in the Book of
Yeah.
Jude?
Yeah, in the book of Enoch, James or Jacob
Book of E- yeah.
Yeah, the book of
references the
Enoch
book
is-
of Enoch.
is
And they're
crazy.
fighting over, you know, Moses' body,
Yeah.
that's in the New Testament.
Okay, so it wasn't, so these writings were obviously known by the apostles.
Very well.
And
Oh, yeah.
they were confident.
Like I said, it was all the rage. Like, before Yeshua stepped on the scene, like, we're going to see later how there were many messiahs that came before Jesus, actually arrived.
Mhm.
Because, again, this is what people are talking about, right? Sorry, I didn't do this yet. This map actually gets bigger. I actually narrowed it down into it, so I'll send you the full map.
Okay, that would be great.
Yeah, I know, because it's very interesting, because then it tells you what, look, Muhammad was born here, you know, or wherever it's actually right here. You have to go where the dot is. And, it's very interesting, if any of you like study like rabbinic literature, or rabbinic history, which I love doing that, this is where rabbinic literature really takes off. So these are categories explaining the different stages of where the rabbis were and where the Jewish community was, and the evolution of rabbinic Judaism, basically, after the destruction of the temple. What happened during, in the aftermath, because, I mean, think about it. The Second Temple was huge. Judaism in Second Temple times was centered around the blood sacrifice system and the priestly system. But you take all that away, you take the core of Judaism. So how now shall we worship? Right?
Yeah.
The rabbis were thinking, how does God want us to worship? We can't offer blood. We can't fulfill the terms of Torah.
Right.
We can't do the sacrifice. We don't have priests anymore, you know? So much changed in the Judaism that took place, the evolution that took place of Judaism after the destruction of the temple. I think it's so important that we study, like, you know, this period. This is where rabbinic Judaism, as you see practiced today among Jewish communities, really start to just develop. It's during the Tanaim period, the Amraim, all of this, you know, and it's so complex, so much. Yeah.
Are these periods named after particular individual groups or particular philosophies?
Question. Yes, so, yeah, so it's certain like rabbinic movements that happen.
Okay, were they geographically located? I mean,
Yeah,
I mean,
a
like-
lot of them were. I have to go back actually to answer that. That's a great question. So I know, man, it's been a while, but Tanaim, they're considered the sages. They're not just rabbis, they're the sages,
Mhm.
okay? Because they really like.
Well, what's
followed-
that name mean? Is that a particular person or a
I
group
don't
of them?
know, I don't remember, I have to go back and look. So they're the sages who like really, were the first to reshift, shift Judaism. And then the Amoraim, this was actually a very, the golden days also of like rabbinic thinking, because they were like commentaries,
Well, where would-
you know.
Where would,
Yeah.
you know, the great sage that was on, I guess, when Spain was before the
Oh,
expulsion, where
Spain.
would,
So that would be right here, just, 1492. No, during here, just before the Crusades, and actually during the Crusades, the golden days of like the Jewish, the the golden days of Judaism, which is actually did take
There's a
place
big
in
rabbi
Spain.
who was in Spain.
It was
that
just before the Crusades.
Uh-huh.
Actually, yeah, it was during, well, when the Arabs were over Spain, but it was a particular kind of Arabs that weren't very extremist.
Right, no, that's
And
clear.
then extremists came in and those glory days died.
Right,
Jewish
right.
community. And then the Crusades began.
Mhm.
And that was just even worse than when
Right.
Muslims were in charge and over the Jewish community.
Yeah, just on that timeline, I remember reading about the council of the Jewish people after the temple was
Yavna?
destroyed.
Yavne.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
that was the instigator. That was when everything changed.
okay, so
because
where would
that
that be on the
saved-
map there?
I think it was
Approximately.
right.
Just like
It's right, 70,
literally,
right?
no,
Right?
70, right here. Like maybe a couple of years after 70, 80.
Wow,
Yeah, because so Akiva, I don't know if you know, like Rabbi Akiva thought that, who's that guy who they thought Bar
Kova?
Kokhba was the Messiah, right? And then when that failed,
That was the revolt that got the Romans
yeah, the
all,
revolt, but
ticked
there
off.
was a particular guy who escaped the revolt, went to Yavne, and basically founded like a seminary that would change Judaism forever there. And that's when all those ideas.
and where did that
started.
happen? I mean, you know, they took out Jerusalem, and then where did the Council of Yavna, was that a place? Was that,
Yavne, in Yavne.
well, where's that today? I
That's,
mean, downtown Silver Spring? and
somewhere in
that-
Israel.
where-
No, it's in Israel.
It is in
Um,
Israel, okay, so the destruction of of Jerusalem was what the Romans did, and then they just moved up the map to,
Yeah, it's in Yavne is in a city, is a city in the central district of Israel.
oh, okay.
That's where they basically established the Tanakh, the canon, right, of the Tanakh. At least that's what, I remember.
That's where they recreated Judaism.
Okay, yeah, but I remember Josh McDowell, his book, where, you know, talked about the canon, development of the canon. He said that
Oh, yeah?
the Old Testament canon was, I thought that the term was Council of Jamnia. Maybe a Jamnia is Yavne, I don't know, but
Yeah, I think that would be, yeah.
But I remember that being where, you know, that's where the canon of the Old Testament, that's where we get our canon, is
Yeah.
from that council, he said.
wow.
So,
Question.
That would have taken place.
Right after, it was 70 AD, he said.
Mhm.
I remember that. It was like, that's curious. It was after Jesus that, at least that's,
After the temple was destroyed.
I forgot where it was in I think it's evidence that the man's a virgin. I recall that. One of his famous books.
You got a question?
Yeah, I'm new to all this. I don't have your background. So after the destruction of the second temple, that's when everything changed. They can no longer sacrifice. So did they decide and just make up their own stuff after
No.
that?
So, one of
Just
the
in a
biggest-
nutshell, I don't want to
no, one of
interrupt,
the
but I don't
biggest
know any of
changes-
this.
No, this is important, this is key. One of the biggest changes that took place in Rabbinic Judaism, or in Judaism after Second Temple times, is that prayers became a sufficient substitute for the blood sacrifices. So now, instead of actually offering blood sacrifices, you prayed at the same time that those sacrifices would have been made, God would hear our prayers. So eventually, what Judaism today revolves around is prayers, good deeds, and repentance. Okay, inscribe your name in the book of life if you do them right and if you have enough of them. Not blood.
Does Judaism of today believe in heaven?
They believe they have, so they call it the world to come, which is actually, in many ways they have, you know, it's so weird because in many ways they have almost a more accurate picture than a lot of Bible-believing believers and Christians who think we're going up to heaven when we die and we're going to spend, you know, Jewish people know that the kingdom's coming down from heaven on earth, right?
Okay.
But at the same time, the Jewish community doesn't talk about this. They don't
No.
talk about the afterlife
No.
because it's too Christian. it gets to, so there's so much here, guys. Okay, during especially the Byzantine and Crusades, right, the Middle Ages especially, you have like Judaism and Christianity, like not only like always friction, you know, there's this friction between them, but they also start influencing each other, okay? But at the same time, there's this intention, the rabbis are trying to intentionally distance themselves from anything that looks, sounds too Christian, because these are what the Christians are doing. And this whole history, the Jewish Christian history between this period is really unfortunate. And it's very bloody, in fact. You see the Christian community persecuting again and again, Jewish community, again, you know, just the Crusades is really like a climax of a lot of that. And like I said, the Jewish communities did better. They were more prosperous under the Arabs than they were under like the Byzantine Empire or the Christendom, basically. And it's really sad because it's an unfortunate history. But going back to your original question, yeah, one of the biggest changes that happened for the New Judaism is that prayers are a sufficient substitute for blood sacrifices.
But if the Tanakh said you had to have the sacrifice, how did they justify that?
Well, how did God accept us when we were in exile all those other years? And in the first, you know, in Babylonian exile or the Persian exile or all these other exiles, you know, they couldn't fulfill the temple duties then either, you know. So they do believe that a third temple is coming and that the blood sacrifices will have to be reinstituted at some point. And they're waiting for that. There's already committees in Israel waiting for, you know, like looking for the red heifer. They're on that.
They got
waiting
the heifer.
for the day of the third
They got
temple.
I saw that.
Yeah. Because
They have the effort.
it's almost like they don't believe that God changed the terms of atonement, especially, but they have to believe that something changed, or is at least, at the very least, you have to say it's ambiguous. We don't really know what God wants from us. The terms of atonement are ambiguous to some extent. We can't be sure because, yeah, prayers are sufficient at the time of exile, but when the temple comes back, yeah, no, it's the blood that will actually accomplish atonement. You know, it's this ambiguity that honestly, I don't believe the God of the Bible he's not an ambiguous God. He's not going to leave the terms of atonement, something so important as atonement, ambiguous. There are all these generations of people perishing. No, those terms are not ambiguous. And the terms don't get changed, right? They get fulfilled.
Yes.
Fulfillment is another level, right? It's a different, that's where the Messianic community took off. And anyway.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to what Maureen was saying there. I mean, all through Daniel, you see that he prayed 3 times a day according to the way it would have been done at the temple.
Yeah.
All right, and according to some sources, Daniel was a eunuch because it was tradition in those days that if you had people serving you at a certain point, that you took away their sexual preferences. Okay, and maybe they did it, and maybe they didn't. There's an argument about that. But the thing is that Daniel was greatly beloved. He was visited by an angel. I mean, this thing about prayer as a type as not a, I would say a substitute, but that there is maybe, an order of preference. When you were out of Israel, then prayer is really important. If you're in, Jerusalem.
There was a tradition.
Yeah, you could do that. But if it was not, you could do prayer and good deeds and so forth. And when you think
and Cornelius is another example of that. He was beloved, and who was it, Paul, or no?
Peter.
Peter
Yes.
visited him. And he was praying at the same time, at 2 or 3 times a day. And he loved the Jewish people. He was doing good deeds and stuff, and he was well known. So again, it's kind of an example of how things evolved. And here's a Gentile that was brought in and accepted.
Yeah.
So it's, you know, this thing about prayer is, the three things, prayer and good deeds
Yeah.
and
And
the
the-
thing of the obvious is
Yeah.
important.
And I
But
would
when
add to.
it comes to actual atonement, these things are not sufficient for that. Because even Cornelius, who did, that, you know, he was heard because of his prayers, but then God brought people to tell
Yeah.
the good news to be covered in the blood.
Yeah,
Because the blood is
Oh,
actually
yeah,
the
yeah.
thing that activates atonement.
yeah.
Well,
That's what I wanna like really emphasize.
Focus on that,
The
yeah.
terms of Torah is clear, and as we just heard in the book of Leviticus, says the life is in the blood, and I have given you the blood on the altar to make atonement for your souls.
but he also says that the blood of bulls and goats doesn't accomplish it. It is,
But still, the blood of bulls and goats for all these years is still a picture
it's a picture,
of
a
a covering
portrait.
that will eventually come,
Mhm.
and, you know, it's a, God still required it, he still demanded Aaron do all that bloody work, you know?
Well,
There's something to blood, right? That the Torah,
Well,
Torah's
you know,
message is
but-
there really is something to blood.
yeah, well, I'm just saying, they were doing all these sacrifices before the exile. It didn't stop it, because their hearts weren't in it.
Well, there were times where God is like, I don't want your sacrifices because you're neglecting poor.
Yeah, but
and
I'm just
not-"
saying, is if it had been efficacious, you know, really to do the job, then they wouldn't have had to go into exile. Because they were, you know, doing all the things they were supposed to do in terms of the temple sacrifices, but it wasn't spirit,
But it still
heartfelt.
doesn't change the term that God demands blood for forgiveness of sins to be accomplished.
But if you, well, I guess the point I'm making is, if you
Apart
don't
from shedding
spiritually,
the
if you
blood,
spiritually, don't apply that to the inside,
Right,
then
so,
the rest of it doesn't make
Right.
any difference.
but the God's way is blood. It doesn't change, that doesn't change, right? You can't replace anything with that. But the way you treat the blood, it depends on.
But the Yeshua is the better sacrifice.
Exactly.
That, and the nature of the better sacrifice, you know, when he was nailed to the cross, it wasn't a priesthood doing it. I mean, you know, his sacrifice didn't have, you know, I would say, all of the ritual around it that we associate with the sacrifices made at the temple. And yet, we know the temple was still standing when he was being sacrificed. So I guess I'm saying is that, you know, yes, a blood sacrifice is required, but God provided a better sacrifice than the one that he had required Israel to do for such a long period of
The blood
time.
sacrifice in the Old Testament always pointed to the Messiah's sacrifice.
Sure,
That would be actually efficacious to remove, not just cover, like Yom Kippur. Kippur comes from the word kafar, which
Right.
is cover.
right,
Right, it's a
right,
temporary covering.
right.
But the actual removal, the actual salach, which is slicha, right?
Mhm, mhm.
Pardon of sin
Yeah,
would be affected by the suffering servant in Isaiah 53. Yeah.
So this is maybe a far out question, I don't have any standing on it, but life is in the blood. And the Messiah said to the lady at the well, said, there'll be a time when you worship me in truth and spirit. The sevenfold spirit was put into the Messiah. And is that sevenfold spirit which was brought down from heaven to earth, the light of the menorah, or the bread of life? And it represents, salvation through him, through that sevenfold spirit.
Interesting. I've never thought of that. It's a great thing for you to research a little further. And
got yourself a
understand.
job, you just tasked yourself.
No, I do believe that everything in the tabernacle and in the temple was symbolic of something and foreshadowed something
To
that
come.
ultimately got fulfilled in the New Testament. So yeah, I've never thought about the seven, lights on the candle, the lampstand,
Mhm.
Of course, it's also repeated in Revelation, the book of Revelation.
I've been looking into that a little
Lampstand,
bit.
yeah.
I'm saying,
So these things are all connected. Yeah.
all right.
No, it's good. It's interesting.
What do you think about Ezekiel's temple? Long as we're way out. Okay, don't go there.
About
It's all
what,
right.
exactly? About what?
It's okay.
What's the
It's okay.
question?
Yeah.
So, the sacrifices that were done before Joshua came, do you think that those sacrifices were really an atonement because of what Yeshua made? Like saying, okay, the blood of Yeshua was applied to those sacrifices, or were those sacrifices did really atone? You know what I mean?
Throughout Israel's history.
Yeah, did the sacrifices were really an atonement at that time, or do you think that the blood of Yeshua was applied to those sacrifices, so that the fact that they were pointing to Yeshua is what made the atonement, kind of
Made it efficacious.
made it
You're-
efficacious, yeah,
You're making this connection because the lamb was slain before the foundation.
exactly.
Yeah, that would work.
So in a way, like, Yeshua was technically slain first, and then earth began, and Israel's history, and God wanted to emphasize and point out the importance of blood. So he instituted the sacrificial system to eventually pave the way and the pattern for Yeshua's coming in his blood.
Yeah, but it was actually the blood of Yeshua applied through all this time. That was the one that was going to be atoned, because, I don't know, if the blood of goats
Bulls and goats and all that.
can atone for.
Well,
But I think she
but
makes a good
this is
point
what
when,
Hebrews has said, for the
Mhm.
blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer sprinkling the unclean sanctifies to the purifying of the flesh. It says it sanctifies to the purifying of the flesh. How much more then shall the blood of Messiah, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, purge your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? Right? And then the one I read this morning in the Josh, Hebrews 7, right? The blood and bulls and goats, they weren't enough. This idea that they weren't enough, right?
Yeah.
right,
Um,
and that priesthood of Aaron, he had to first make sacrifices for himself before he
Exactly.
could make sacrifices for the nation.
Yeah. Yep.
So,
So, I mean, I don't want to say that the blood of bulls and goats had no efficacy, absolutely none, and that they were all symbolic, because God, he
Yeah.
instituted it for centuries,
Yeah.
and in precise ways. If you did it wrong, like if the high priest did it wrong, it wouldn't have worked. Something would, it was serious business.
Yeah.
So there was some measure, some weight to it.
But do you get, I'm going to Gary, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just trying to tease it out a little bit more, and again, it's not a good understanding, but, how do you come before the King of the universe? How do you approach him? Even in our societies as we know them a little bit, when, some president or vice minister comes to visit some other country, they bring a gift, or they present themselves and show them things, and that seems to be throughout society, that, when they entertain one another, they bring a gift of some sort to show graciousness or kindness or gentleness or whatever. And here's the King of the universe. He walked with Adam and Eve in the garden. When they sinned, there was a sacrifice made there of the lamb right there, so that they could have some sort of a presence with God. And if you look at all these, I'm just thinking here of all the sacrifices that we're bringing to him so that we can enter closer to his presence, to understand him a little bit further. And the Messiah did it all. I mean, he offered himself spiritually with his blood and whatever that, spirit, sevenfold spirit is, he's with the King of the universe. His sacrifice is final there. I don't know, I'm just trying to tease it out.
Yeah, I do want to put, the first verse in Leviticus 17:11 says, "The life is in the blood."
Yeah,
Animals really have life in them,
yeah, they did.
and in the spilling of their real blood, there was life that actually died, you know? And that life is the thing that like is what you represent as that substitute, you know? This animal is gonna take my death and I will take its life. It's a substitutionary atonement. And I'm not gonna say that that wasn't real life, that was spilled in the blood, you know, like, that was a covering of some sort. It was, at the very least, you know, that temporary covering that Yom Kippur offered, with all that life dying and substituted for the people. But was it sufficient to actually remove sin and enter into God's presence and holies of holies and full, you know, that fullness, that full way? I don't know.
It seems to me that there's some kind of connection, because, or maybe the fact that it pointed out and that it was going to be fulfilled.
Yeah, there was always the.
There was one part, but then there still needed the.
Yeah, well, and I think Israel felt that because every year, for every sin, and they always had, every year the high priest had to sacrifice, you know? He sacrifices him to be made all the time. But Yeshua offered himself once for all time. You don't need this repeat anymore, which is what the writer of Hebrews says. Yeah, you're the last, we have to move on.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Okay,
The time just flew by.
okay, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I was trying to pick up on,
Itself.
Etzel's, point, is that would it not, it makes sense that the lamb slain from the beginning of the world is what made Abraham able to do what he did, and, you know, and God talked to him, and the same thing what he did with, you know, the patriarchs, and in those days, there was no temple. You know, and then there was 400 years, you know, when they were in Egypt, and there was no temple. And only when they come out and they begin to receive the commandments is there a requirement to build a temple and to do these sacrifices. So, you know, so I'm just thinking that, you know, maybe it is that he has, you know, sure, it's the blood that atones, but it was slaughtered from the beginning of the world. It had already taken place. And then we, later on, get to see its fulfillment in the Messiah.
Well, this gets into the timeless realm, right? The blood has been slain, you know, the lamb has been slain.
Well, what about
Melchizedek? This is mysterious.
Well, what about Melchizedek? I mean, Melchizedek is his name? Yeah, I mean, you know, Abraham gave tithes to him. He was called priest of Salem, right? And he was king also.
Right. That's why he
So-
comes in his order.
Yeah, that suggests that there is a, you know, a pre-appearance of him.
One more,
Yeah, go ahead.
First Peter 4 says that, and I know this passage is not, it's not that clear, but it says that the gospel was preached to the people beforehand, and that they might receive the Holy Spirit, which is curious. Let me read it for you real fast.
Yeah, First Peter 4.
So, 1 Peter 4. For this was the reason that God's good news was proclaimed even to those now dead, so that they, though they are judged in the flesh before humans, they might live in the Ruach before God.
Yeah, this is one.
I mean, I don't really know what the passage means, but it might refer to, and there was another passage where he went down.
Yeah,
to
yeah,
Hades,
right.
and he preached to those.
Yeah.
Kind of obscure scriptures, but there could be, it might be tied to that if that is true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's obscure.
We'll let you go. Let my people go. We'll let you
Yeah,
go.
that's my friend
And
said,
that-
we're all in Egypt, you know, we need to go.
And I don't know if you've talked about that at the end of sacrifice.
Mm. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, interesting discussion. If anybody wants to pick up on those things and study them, you know, deeper, and then let me know if you want to present again on
There you go.
whatever you find.
Yeah, I thought you made a good point, yeah.
Yeah. So this is where we actually left off. And we didn't go over this, but let's, as I said, let's get even more specific as to the Jewish messianic expectations. So you know how Second Temple times, you know, when the Gospels open up, we know the Jewish communities are all divided. There's so many factions, so many divisions. No one community agrees with the other. This really is characteristic of Second Temple times. But despite all those Jewish factions and all those divisions and disagreements, there is in fact one major messianic expectation that all the rabbis, right, all the Qumran communities, the Qumran community, which is by the Dead Sea, all the Pharisees and all the Sadducees and even all the common folk, the average, you know, fishermen, Jewish fishermen, that there is this one messianic expectation that they did have in common, that they all shared. Basically, a prophet like
Moses, yeah.
Messiah would be a prophet like Moses. There is a concept that appears in ancient rabbinic commentaries called midrashim. Okay, so when I say ancient rabbinic commentaries, we're actually thinking this period. Well, really all of these, they're always making commentaries, but ancient would be, specifically the commentaries would be the Amoraim and the Amoraim as well. So, the Septuagint, right? So there is a concept that appears in these commentaries that says, like the first Redeemer, so the last Redeemer. Okay, so the idea here is that the final Messianic Redeemer will be patterned upon the first Redeemer, Moses. Okay? And there are a multitude of patterns that are drawn between Moses and the anticipated Messiah in this midrashim. So by the way, this information that we're going to cover shortly here comes from a paper that one of our Chosen People Ministries missionaries did. He's former apologist, so if you want to read that, I can send it to you as well, just probably talk to me afterward. So, here are some examples that we find in the Midrashim. Okay, so in Pisgah 5:8, we see as the first Redeemer appeared among Israel and then disappeared from among them, so the last Redeemer will appear among Israel and then disappear from among them. So in other words, just as Moses had two comings to Israel, namely his birth and then his coming after the burning bush as their Redeemer, so the Messiah will have a first coming and a second coming.
Terrific.
Where's the date for that?
Say it?
Date for that? I mean,
This is in Pisgah, it's a Midrashim.
It's a midrashim.
So this is in Talmud.
Oh, okay.
We find this in the rabbinic commentaries and specifically Pisgah 5:8.
Okay.
Another Midrashim, Kohelet Rabbah 1:9, gives a series of parallels between Moses and Messiah. So here are just a couple, I believe. Oh yeah. So just as Moses rode on a donkey in Exodus 4:20, so too the final Redeemer will be lowly and ride on a donkey, as Zechariah 9 says. And then just as the first Redeemer caused manna to come down to Israel, so too the last Redeemer will cause manna, or bread, to come down. As the first Redeemer caused the well to give water, as we see in Numbers 20, so the last Redeemer will cause water to spring forth as well. And this has a note here to compare to Joel 3:18, which says, "Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who dwells in Zion, my holy mountain. Jerusalem will be holy, never again to be overrun by foreigners. In that day, the mountains will drip new or sweet wine, and the hills will flow with milk. All the ravines of Judah will run with water. A fountain will flow out of the Lord's house and will water the valley of Acacias." Now, just thinking of this in comparison to Jesus even turning water into sweet new wine, that was his first miracle, right? I wouldn't exactly call that miracle a fulfillment of Joel 3, but I do see it as a foretaste of that fulfillment, a taste and see moment, right? Taste and see and anticipate the rest of the fulfillment of this prophecy, right? Jesus was in fact, I think, offering a glimpse into who he truly is as the Messianic King who has the power and the authority to one day cause this entire land of Israel to drip with new sweet
Yeah,
milk,
good.
as the prophecy says. Yeah.
Yeah, just like that first miracle he did, you know, he turned the water to wine. And he said later, you know, drink my blood. It's the life, and my body is the bread of life. He said, I'm not gonna drink this blood again until the kingdom to come. So what is that blood?
Well, the
Yeah, I mean-
wine. I will not drink of this wine.
Yeah, exactly. But anyway.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Good connection. Yeah, no, Jesus interacted with wine all the time, guys. No, there really is a strong biblical connection between blood and wine,
Yeah,
bread and flesh.
yeah.
So it wasn't, you know, innovative stuff, weird stuff that Yeshua was bringing up. No, it was very familiar to the Jewish mind at this day. So another midrashing, the Targum Jonathan to Exodus 12. This is a midrash commentary on Exodus 12:42. And in this commentary, the rabbis say that the Messiah will lead a flock of Israel out of Rome in the end times, and Moses will lead a flock of Israel out of the wilderness.
Mhm. Yes.
So basically, they're connecting just as Moses delivered people out of Egypt into Israel.
But he doesn't actually deliver them out of the wilderness entirely. He got hung up in that water issue. So Joshua is the one that actually,
Yeah, but okay, Moses got in here. Yeah. Okay. So, but basically, just as Moses was that redeemer, right, to lead the flock of Israel out of the wilderness, so Messiah will deliver us from Rome, right? So also the Targum to Song of Solomon 4:5 says that the Messiah, son of David, is comparable to Moses, the Messiah, son of Ephraim, Joseph's son. Sorry, I read that wrong. The Messiah is comparable to Moses. And Messiah, son of Ephraim, Joseph, is like his partner Aaron. Okay, so the Messiah, son of David, is like Moses. The Messiah, son of Ephraim, which is Joseph's son, is like his partner Aaron. Okay, so both of these messiahs are called redeemers, just like Moses was. Okay, and then finally the Targum to Lamentations 2:22 says that, says of God, you will proclaim freedom to your people, the house of Israel, by the hand of the King Messiah, as you did by the hand of Moses and Aaron on the day of Passover, leading Israel to look for a redeemer like Moses on Passover. So we also know that Yeshua passed away when? On Passover, 14 years on. Okay, so again, even though the Talmud and these midrashim were written much later, these concepts were still very well and alive during Second Temple times and just before the birth of Yeshua. So I guess some orientation here. These midrashim are called oral Torah, okay? And it's called oral Torah because they were first orally transmitted before they were written down. They actually got written down, you might be surprised by this, around 200 to 300. That far, yeah. Way after the Gospels were already recorded,
Wow.
and even epistles, okay? So they didn't get written down until around this period. And, yeah, but nevertheless, they were still orally, a lot of them were orally present.
So this was like the Mishnah and the Gemara?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, Mishnah, the Gemara, the Talmud, and this incorporates the commentaries as well, which is the Midrash. So, okay. Let's move on here. I'm doing pretty well now. Okay, so now I'm just going to be reading from that paper that I mentioned earlier. This is very interesting. So, the Jews of the first century saw themselves as slaves to a great foe. Oh, okay, they saw themselves as slaves to a great foe, not slaves of Egypt, but slaves of Rome. They hated the power of Rome and its meddling hands in the land of Egypt. In the land of Judea. They hated the taxes and the military occupation and the political necessity of mixing Jewish religion with pagan Roman politics. That compromise that we were always talking about, right? They wanted a redeemer to come and to lead Israel out of her slavery. They wanted a prophet like Moses. The problem was that there is no such prophet. In fact, prophecy has ceased with Malachi. There was no end in sight and no redemption around the corner. But they yearned for there to be a redeemer like Moses, but he hadn't yet come. So whenever there is a great felt need and a great expectation for relief, there is always going to be people who get too excited and get carried away. Josephus gives us multiple accounts of failed messianic movements during this period, just before Jesus, right? And here's a sampling of them. In Josephus's Wars, 7.437 there, Jonathan arose in Cyrene and got people to follow him out to the desert, promising signs and wonders. Also in Antiquities, Theudas arose and got followers to believe that he had the power to part the Jordan River. Also, several impostors and deceivers persuaded the multitude to follow them into the wilderness and pretended that they would exhibit manifest wonders and signs that should be performed by the providence of God. And then lastly, Antiquities 20, a certain impostor got people to follow him out to the desert, promising the people deliverance. Now, in every single one of these cases, the leader of the movement is crushed and usually tortured and killed. Okay? And it's interesting, it really should be striking just how closely these imposters are following, in fact, a predictable pattern, right? Head out into the wilderness, get a bunch of followers, perform signs and wonders, and do everything possible to convince everyone that you are the new Moses, in fact, who will lead Israel to her redemption from her oppressors. Following this predictable pattern.
Isn't this a problem in the sense of everybody being asked to leave Israel and go into the desert? I mean, that just seems like it overthrows the entire concept. I mean, if you want Rome to stop being Rome, because Rome, you're in the promised land. Rome happens to control it at the time. Isn't it a similar kind of situation like it was with Jeremiah in the time of Babylon, where they were told to stay put while Babylon did what it was going to do, and then they decided they would escape and go to Egypt, where they promptly were killed. I mean,
So what are you saying?
I guess the point is that this seems like a difficult thing for people to want to leave the promised land, the land that they were finally in, and go into the desert. I'm not
The
sure.
wilderness is where Moses led the people.
Well, yes, but he
So
came out of,
Yes, but they're following this pattern.
oh, okay, that's
Moses'
just a part of
leadership was
the
during
pattern.
wilderness. You know, like that's where he was, and whatever, I don't know, like this
Well,
was
okay,
the
but-
expectation, yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying, I'm just keeping in mind the fact that they didn't have to be in the wilderness for very long until they disobeyed, and then they got their 40
Yeah,
years.
that's true, that's true. Yeah, the whole point was a promised land.
Did these false prophets perform miracles?
I don't know.
We don't know.
I don't know,
You
yeah.
know,
And it's hard to even
thinking
believe
like
someone like
witchcraft kind of
Josephus.
stuff.
Well, yeah. I mean, even Yeshua himself was accused of, Egyptian magician, being an Egyptian magician, sorcery and stuff like that, because Egypt was known for that. But the whole point of really seeing this is that there were a lot of imposters and false messiahs, and why did people follow them? Because they came in this predictable pattern that was all very prevalent in this time. We're looking for a Moses-like Messiah. This is the pattern that all the Jewish communities agreed on, right? It's because the coming of a new Moses was the widespread confident hope, you know, that the Jewish people had at this time, okay?
So those
So-
deceptions were before Joshua?
Yeah.
Or?
Yes, yes. So on the heels of all these false messiahs trying to impersonate Moses, arrives Yeshua, who is in fact the prophet like Moses and the son of David. Okay? And Yeshua called this out, okay, when he said, all those who have come before me are thieves and robbers, the imposters, right? And just as Moses and David himself, they were both shepherds, right? Not just literally, but also metaphorically in the sense of being shepherds of Israel. Yeshua also identifies himself as the good shepherd, thus ingraining the idea of Moses and David even more, right? But now let's consider something, okay? What do you think, if you were living in that time, what do you think after all this time and after all these false messiahs and all their false wonders and imposter after imposter after imposter, what do you have good reason to be suspect of Yeshua, also just another candidate running for messianic office, right? On the heels of all these imposters. Now, Second Temple times, they didn't exactly have a litmus test back in, okay?
Yeah.
But they did have something very similar, okay? They had a Mosaic test.
Yeah.
Mosaic litmus test, which of course tested messianic imposters against the profile and pattern of Moses. Okay, and perhaps many of them were, you know, Gamaliel's wisdom, right? He remembered all these, listen, this guy rose up, Thaddeus rose up, you know, and nothing eventually came out of them. Okay? They failed the test. They're not the true prophet like Moses, right? Let's see if this new messianic movement fails the test or endures, basically, right? So maybe those imposters failed the test because they didn't actually perform signs and wonders, and you can imagine that that would be really hard to actually imitate what Yeshua actually did, especially when Yeshua comes on the scene and finally shows those signs and wonders. Anyway, so the point here though is let's hook up Yeshua to the Mosaic test. Should we do that?
Sure.
How well does Yeshua measure up to the pattern of Moses? Now, we modern readers, when we open the book of Matthew, we don't really catch on to this, but Matthew actually answers this question for us in his entire gospel. Okay? Much of what Matthew records Yeshua doing in his gospel account is an allusion to Moses himself, intending to show his Jewish readers how Yeshua is that prophet like Moses. And because let's remember Matthew's writing to a Jewish audience specifically, right? And also let's remember that Jewish writers are more into showing rather than just telling. They don't look these up. I know some of these you can look them up later.
Moses' face radiated with the bright glory of the Lord. Exodus 34. Jesus' face shone like the sun, and his garments became as white as light during his transfiguration. Matthew 17. While interceding for Israel, Moses was willing for God to curse him by blotting him out of his book. Exodus 32. Jesus willingly became a curse for us, Deuteronomy 21, in order to redeem all peoples from the curse of the law, Galatians 3. In his parting words, Moses commissioned Joshua to lead the people into possessing the land, assuring him the Lord will be with him. In his parting words, Jesus commissioned his disciples to take the gospel into all the nations, assuring them he will be with them always, even to the end of the age. Matthew 28. Israel entered into the Mosaic covenant with God through Moses. All people enter into the new covenant with God through Messiah Jesus.
So I'm not sure any other previous imposter or Messiah could claim all that,
Yeah.
right? And I know, like, I think, you know, these are for you to take home and study them, study the texts, compare them, you know, and it's really quite fascinating to see all the parallels. And Matthew is trying to bring this to our focus. He was showing, like, listen, this is the true prophet, like Moses. He comes and he fulfills so much of that profile that Moses built. Yeah.
It makes sense that whenever you speak to a Jew that has refused to look at the Brit Hadashah, and because of culture and all that, that's not a Messianic believer, but then once they do, they see the Jewishness of the scriptures and see how Messiah really is, who had been spoken of for all those years and centuries and generations. How it's just that really eye-opening and like, there he is, experience, like,
Yeah.
wow.
And, going back to that timeline, that map, what happened, another significant thing that happened in Jewish Christian history is that, especially around the Byzantine Empire, right, Constantine was the one to outlaw anything Jewish, right? So he outlawed Passover and throughout, like, as time went, there was a doing away of anything Jewish, right? Parting of the ways, it's called, between Judaism and what is now becoming Christianity. He wanted a Christianity that stood apart from any Jewish foundation. You can't do that. I'm sorry, you can't do that. But nevertheless, Christian history developed in such a way that this distance became so ingrained, so cemented in Christian minds and Jewish minds, so that now, like, trying to, like, rebuild those bridges. This is the work we need to be doing now, showing the Jewishness of Jesus, the scriptures. Like, this is a Jewish book. Look at these Jewish connections. Matthew's portraying Jesus as Moses, and these will speak to a Jewish mind. It's no wonder Jewish people are so closed off to anything Christian, because it's not anything familiar to. It's not Jewish to them.
And it's
Jesus
the same
is
thing.
Jewish.
Yeah, and it's the same thing even with anti-Semitism, because just thinking about, coming from that Christian background and
Well, that's
that
where
disconnect.
anti-Semitism comes from. It's the same Jewish Christian history.
Yeah, that disconnect that was there, and then finally your eyes and your heart being opened, you're like, I've missed this. And so then it's like that desire to embrace it.
It's
even
really
more.
unfortunate because you have a lot of the great patriarchs, like great fathers of the faith, like Augustine. I love Augustine. Like, when I read his Confessions, I'm like, this is my brother in Christ. I loved him, but he also
St. Augustine.
was so against the Jewish people. St. Martin Luther and all these great pillars of the Christian faith. Unfortunately, they represent that too within.
Yeah, I would just, to go with what Keisha was saying there, when you think about the fact that Jesus came to his people in Israel, I think that's a big thing, even though we don't want to necessarily talk about it, but he was in Israel, okay? He was in the land of promise. Now, what exactly could he deliver the people from? They had already arrived where Moses and everybody was talking about getting to the land of promise and everything. They were there. So what John the Baptist and others were saying, there's something more. Jesus is just not coming here so that you can have more fruits and vegetables in the land of Israel, because you got this. And even the Romans wanted to have more stuff. There was something more he wanted for the world to understand. And I think it was spiritual, because they were already in the land. And, the idea that somehow or another, okay, he's like Moses, but Moses was trying to take people from a point of slavery through the wilderness to the promised land. Okay, that was the goal. They got there. And then something happened spiritually that allowed them to be dispossessed or even overcome. But that whole thing of the land, which people, I think, to some degree maybe underestimate its importance, but that was the whole project. With Moses, is to get them there. With Joshua, to get them in the land. So when Yeshua comes, what is his project there? They are in the land. Isn't it got to be something bigger? Something more profound? And he's there, and the temple is there.
They were thinking bigger. The Jewish community were thinking, get Rome off our backs.
Yeah, but think about that. Is Rome, when we talk about getting Rome off our backs or whatever it is, for the time when Israel was under the Philistines, they were under the Moabites, they were under first blah, 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 and then another.
Right, but
And
every time God
He
rose up
rose up somebody to
deliver them.
protect them. Why doesn't that happen here?
But it is happening in the Gospels. Everybody's expecting Yeshua to, like, when they're welcoming him in Jerusalem, they're
Well, yeah, I mean,
saying, Hosanna,
right, there is
save
that
us
part.
now. What do you think they meant?
Well,
Save us
yeah.
from slavery to sin?
Yeah, but it just seems to me like there is a bigger project there spiritually.
Absolutely,
You
there
know.
is. No, it absolutely is. But
But if they hadn't had all these other stuff and got Rome angry at them, of course, that had to happen, you know.
But let's also consider, it wasn't just Rome, it was all these centuries of being in exile with having another kingdom, human kingdom crushing them, even though they had this prophecy of an everlasting kingdom, you know? They were under the Babylonians, the Persians, the Medes.
And
the
so was everybody
Greeks,
else.
the-
You know, but they had,
That's a big
they
deal.
had a
It's a
God.
big deal when you have your kind of God that we
Right.
know is a real God.
Right, and he knows about it. I mean, you know, I guess what I'm saying is that it seems to me that spiritual dimension of Jesus being in the land, you know, coming in the land and doing these miracles in the land had a more profound impact. When he talks to the lady at the well and he says, lady, it's not this mountain, it's not that mountain, it's spiritual.
Yeah, and it's interesting because during Jesus' day in Second Temple times, it's almost as if Israel had become Egypt all over again.
In some
Israel
ways.
was Egypt. Herod was Pharaoh.
Well, he liked the Romans, he
He
grew up
did
in their
what Pharaoh
household.
did.
Yeah.
He slaughtered all these kids. He repeated these Exodus events.
You know,
Like, so.
better to be Herod's
it's-
pig than his sons.
Yeah, there was, I would say that there's a lot of deliverance levels that needed to happen. A lot of, levels of redemption.
Yeah,
But I think the biggest one in, Jewish people's minds was the problem with Rome,
yeah.
just like the problem with the Philistines, right? But again, I remember this, but we talk about how Jesus is a greater Messiah than even David, because David, yes, he slew the Goliath and the Philistines, he got them out.
Right,
But Jesus does something more. He conquers his enemies.
Yeah.
yeah.
He says, love your enemies. You have heard it said, hate your enemies. But I'm elevating the Torah now, right? There's a greater deliverance that he's trying to get the people to see and not be so wrapped up in their human fleshly worldview of Rome is the enemy. Rome is our biggest problem. Rome's our biggest problem, It's not. There's so much more there, as you're pointing out. But I think it's really hard for the people to see that in his day because Rome is such an iron
Impressive.
fist.
Yeah.
Such an so
Think of how the Greeks felt about it. I mean, they didn't like the fact that they were conquered by Rome.
sure,
Nobody liked it.
yeah.
I mean,
I'm sure the Greeks felt a little proud. They're like, oh, look, they took our gods, they took our language, we're still here,
yeah.
But anyways, that's all we have time for
Oh,
today.
Thank you so much.
Take the charts.
Thank you.
Use that in your conversations with Jewish people too, It's a great chart to study.
Great job.
Thank you for this
Thank you.
study. We
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it.
So in 2 weeks, we'll meet again.
2 weeks.